What did the North Vietnamese Army expect to see when they scanned the coastline near the DMZ in September 1968? Not a battleship. Nobody expected a battleship. Colonel Nguyen Van Thuong commanded an NVA artillery regiment dug into positions just north of the Ben Hai River, the waterway that split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. His intelligence staff tracked American naval movements with disciplined regularity. Destroyers rotated through gunfire support stations offshore. The occasional cruiser appeared. These were known quantities. Their guns ranged from 5 to 8 inches. Their accuracy was acceptable. Their shells could collapse a bunker if the spotter was good. Thuong's regiment had adapted. They built positions with overhead cover rated to survive a near miss from a 6-inch round. They dispersed ammunition stores. They moved at night, fired in short bursts, relocated before counter-battery fire arrived. The system worked. American destroyers had become a manageable problem. The NVA's broader assessment of American naval power reflected a specific institutional confidence. Soviet military advisors had briefed their Vietnamese counterparts extensively on the U.S. Navy's force structure, and the consensus was clear. The battleship era was finished. The USS New Jersey had been mothballed in 1957. Her 3 sisters sat in similar states of cold storage at naval yards from Washington to New Jersey. The Soviet Navy had scrapped its own battleships years earlier. According to a captured NVA planning document from mid-1968, American naval gunfire was categorized as a secondary threat, dangerous to exposed troops, but survivable with proper fortification. The primary concern was B-52 strikes from Guam. None of this accounted for what arrived on September 29th. On September 29, 1968, the crew of the USS New Jersey, hull number BB-62, brought her 9 16-inch guns within range of the Vietnamese coast for the first time. She had been pulled from the mothball fleet at Philadelphia just 14 months earlier, reactivated at a cost of $21.5 million because someone at the Pentagon had done arithmetic that the rest of the defense establishment initially dismissed. A single 16-inch shell weighed 2,700 pounds. One broadside from the New Jersey delivered more explosive force than an entire destroyer could manage in an hour of sustained fire. She could hit targets 23 miles inland, and she could do it all night long, every night, for weeks. The first NVA units to experience this did not understand what was happening to them. A 16-inch high-capacity shell doesn't just destroy a bunker, it excavates the earth around it. The blast crater alone measures 50 feet across and 20 feet deep. Concussion kills at distances where fragmentation cannot reach. Troops in positions built to withstand destroyer fire found their overhead cover, logs, packed earth, concrete in some cases, turned into secondary fragmentation that killed the men underneath. An NVA after-action report, recovered months later, used a phrase that American intelligence officers translated with visible satisfaction. The document described the New Jersey's fire as producing an effect like the sky falling in pieces. Their word for it, not ours. Colonel Thuong's regiment lost 17 fighting positions in the first 48 hours of the New Jersey's deployment. His carefully engineered survivability doctrine had been built around a threat that no longer represented the ceiling of what the Americans could deliver from the sea. 11 years. That's how long the USS New Jersey sat in Philadelphia, wrapped in dehumidification cocoons, her turrets greased and sealed, her boilers cold. From 1957 to 1967, she was officially in reserve, a bureaucratic designation that meant the Navy acknowledged she existed, but preferred not to think about her. The Pentagon of the early 1960s was an institution intoxicated by the future. Robert McNamara's systems analysts measured everything in cost-per-kill ratios and sortie generation rates. Nuclear submarines, carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, fast attack craft, These represented modern naval power. A 45,000-ton battleship with guns designed in the 1930s fit nowhere in their spreadsheets. The New Jersey burned 2,000 barrels of fuel oil per day at cruising speed. She required a crew of 1,556 men. The annual operating cost to keep her active exceeded what it took to run 4 destroyers. On paper, she was an absurdity. Captain Edward Smith thought the paper was wrong. Smith had served aboard the New Jersey during her Korean War deployment in 1951-52, when her 16-inch guns had shattered Chinese supply lines above the 38th parallel. He'd watched a single turret do in 90 seconds what a flight of 4 F-9F Panthers took an entire afternoon to accomplish, and with better accuracy. By 1965, Smith was working a desk job at the Bureau of Naval Weapons, and he started writing memos. The memos went to people who did not want to receive them. His argument was straightforward. Vietnam's coastal geography put most of the enemy's logistics infrastructure within range of naval guns. Aircraft were expensive, vulnerable to ground fire, and couldn't fly in bad weather. A battleship could operate around the clock regardless of conditions. The memos disappeared into filing cabinets for 2 years. The British had learned something about institutional resistance to old weapons during the Falklands War, though that came later in 1982, when the Royal Navy discovered it had retired its last conventional aircraft carriers, just in time to desperately need them in the South Atlantic. The parallel runs deeper than timing. Defense planners in both countries had constructed force structures around assumptions about what future wars would look like. The actual wars bore no resemblance to the planning scenarios. The British had to improvise with Harrier jump jets operating from converted cargo ships. The Americans, at least, still had their battleships sitting in mothballs. The question was whether anyone would authorize pulling one out. What changed the arithmetic was the Tet Offensive. After January 1968, the demand for fire support along the DMZ exceeded what available naval assets could provide. Destroyers were being cycled through gunfire support stations so rapidly that their gun barrels were wearing out. The 5-inch guns on a Fletcher-class destroyer had a barrel life of roughly 4,600 rounds before accuracy degraded to unacceptable levels. Barrels were being replaced at rates the supply chain couldn't sustain. Meanwhile, NVA artillery positions north of the DMZ had grown bold enough to shell American positions at Con Thien and Gio Linh in broad daylight. Knowing the destroyers offshore lacked the punch to dig them out of reinforced positions. Someone, the record is ambiguous on exactly who deserves credit, pulled Smith's old memos out of those filing cabinets. By March 1968, the Chief of Naval Operations had authorized the New Jersey's reactivation. The shipyard workers at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard accomplished something remarkable. They brought a World War II battleship from dead storage to combat readiness in less than a year. Boilers that hadn't fired since Eisenhower's first term were brought back to pressure. Electrical systems were overhauled. The fire control computers, analog mechanical devices that calculated shell trajectories using gears and cams, were tested and found to be still accurate within their original specifications. Even the teak weather decks, warped and cracked from a decade of Pennsylvania winters, were stripped and relaid. The cost skeptics weren't entirely silenced. A Congressional Budget Office review noted that reactivating the New Jersey cost roughly the same as building a new guided missile frigate. What the review failed to calculate was the tonnage of ordnance the New Jersey could deliver per dollar spent. One 16-inch shell cost approximately $1,800 in 1968 money. A single sortie by an F-4 Phantom carrying general-purpose bombs cost north of $10,000 and put 2 aircrew at risk. Smith's memos had made exactly this point. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard smelled like a chemical accident in the summer of 1967. Workers who cut through the first preservation cocoons on Turret 2 reported a wall of cosmoline fumes so thick it triggered the yard's hazardous vapor alarms. Cosmoline, a petroleum-based grease the Navy slathered on every exposed metal surface before mothballing, had spent 11 years baking into a semi-solid amber crust inside the gun houses. It had to come off by hand. Scrapers, wire brushes, rags soaked in kerosene. The turret crews worked in temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees inside the unventilated steel compartments. One shipfitter later described the smell as somewhere between a hot tar roof and a diesel spill in a closed garage. Below the turrets, the engineering spaces presented a different problem entirely. The New Jersey's power plant consisted of 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, feeding 4 sets of General Electric geared turbines. Combined output, 212,000 shaft horsepower. Each boiler stood 2 stories tall and contained miles of steam tubing that had to be individually inspected for corrosion, metal fatigue, tube wall thinning, and pitting. The inspection teams found the preservation had held remarkably well, a testament to the Navy's mothballing procedures, which involved filling the boiler drums with nitrogen gas to prevent oxidation, but remarkably well and ready to produce 600 psi superheated steam were 2 different standards. The first boiler light-off happened on December 21, 1967. Chief Engineman Robert Halverson was standing on the upper level of Fire Room No. 1 when the burners ignited. The roar was instantaneous and physical, felt through the deck plates and boot soles, felt in the chest cavity before the ears fully registered it. 11 years of silence ended in a sustained thunder that shook loose a decade's worth of fine rust particles from overhead piping throughout the engineering spaces. The air turned orange-brown for several minutes. Men who had served on destroyers and cruisers stood motionless. The sound of a battleship's boilers existed on a different scale than anything else in the surface fleet. Getting the boilers lit was the milestone that mattered. But hundreds of smaller resurrections were happening simultaneously across the ship's 887-foot length. Electricians traced wiring runs through compartments that hadn't been opened since the Korean War. Gunners' mates test-cycled the hydraulic rammers that loaded 16-inch projectiles. Each ram had to push a 2,700-pound shell and its 6 powder bags into the breech with mechanical precision, every time under combat conditions. The fire control radar, an AN/SPG-12 system that could track a target at 40,000 yards and feed range data directly into the analog ballistic computers, was powered up, calibrated, and found to be drifting by less than 15 yards at maximum range. The shipyard delivered the New Jersey back to the fleet on April 6, 1968. 5 months ahead of the original schedule. 5 months and 18 days separated the recommissioning ceremony from the first combat round fired. The New Jersey transited the Pacific at a sustained 25 knots, fast enough to leave her escort destroyers struggling to keep station. She arrived at her first gunfire support position, designated Station 10A, roughly 16 miles off the coast south of the DMZ, at 2:30 a.m. on September 30, 1968. Captain J. Edward Snyder had the crew at general quarters before dawn. The first fire mission request came from a Marine spotter ashore at 6:22 a.m. An NVA bunker complex embedded in a ridgeline 4 miles inland had been shrugging off destroyer fire for weeks. The Marines had watched 5-inch shells impact the position without meaningful effect. The overhead cover was too thick, the earth too deep. The angle of the slope gave the defenders everything they needed. Turret 2 fired the New Jersey's first combat rounds in Vietnam at 6:29 a.m. 2 shells. The spotter's correction came back almost immediately. Right 50, fire for effect. The full 9-gun broadside that followed registered on seismograph equipment at a geological survey station in Da Nang, 80 miles to the south. The Marine spotter's report used language that bordered on unprofessional. According to the decklog, he transmitted, "Scratch 1 ridgeline. The whole thing is gone. Repeat, the ridgeline is gone." What a 16-inch shell does to a fortified position requires clinical description. The Mark 13 high-capacity shell carried 153 pounds of Composition D explosive inside a casing designed to penetrate before detonating. Upon impact with earth or light fortification, the shell buries itself roughly 30 feet before the base detonating fuse triggers. The explosion happens underground. The effect is volcanic. A column of earth, debris, and whatever occupied that space erupts upward and outward. Bunkers don't collapse. They cease to exist as coherent structures. The surrounding earth liquefies momentarily from the shockwave, then resolidifies into a cratered moonscape that bears no resemblance to the terrain that existed seconds before. In her first 24 hours on the gun line, the New Jersey fired 29 missions, totaling over 200 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. The after-action summary from 3rd Marine Amphibious Force Headquarters noted that targets which had survived weeks of airstrikes and destroyer bombardment were being neutralized in single-fire missions. A supply depot near Vinh that intelligence had flagged as heavily fortified and dispersed across 14 separate storage bunkers was reduced to open ground in 40 minutes. The New Jersey's fire control team walked the shells across the complex with a precision that the Marine spotters found difficult to reconcile with the age of the ship's targeting systems. Those analog computers, the same Ford Instrument Company Mark 8 range keepers that had directed fire against Japanese positions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were calculating ballistic solutions with a consistency that digital systems of the era could not have matched in the salt-air, high-vibration environment of a firing warship. Captain Snyder sent a situation report to 7th Fleet Headquarters that evening. The language was measured, as situation reports tend to be, but one line stood out. Ship performed to design specifications. Navy understatement of a particular vintage. The New Jersey had been designed to fight other battleships in open ocean engagements where a miss by 50 yards meant nothing. Turning those guns on fixed land targets was like using a sledgehammer on finishing nails. The targets didn't stand a chance, and the crew knew it from the first salvo. Gunner's mate First Class David Prowse kept a personal tally on the inside of his locker door in the Turret 1 handling room. Hash marks in grease pencil grouped by week. By the time the New Jersey completed her Vietnam deployment in April 1969, Prowse's locker door had run out of space twice. He'd started using the bulkhead. The official count? 5,688 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and 14,891 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. Expended in 122 days on the gun line. Those numbers need context. During the entirety of World War II, from her commissioning in 1943 through the Japanese surrender in 1945, the New Jersey fired 771 16-inch rounds. Her Korean War deployment added another 895. Combined across both conflicts, 1,666 rounds of main battery ammunition fired in anger over roughly 2 years of intermittent combat operations spanning 2 wars and 2 oceans. Vietnam tripled that figure in 4 months. The 5-inch expenditure was just as lopsided. The New Jersey's 20 secondary battery guns, 10 twin mounts arranged along her upper works, fired more rounds during her Vietnam cruise than the combined 5-inch expenditure of every cruiser and destroyer on the gun line during the same period. According to the Naval Gunfire Support Activity Report, for the quarter ending March 1969, the New Jersey alone accounted for 41% of all naval gunfire missions in the War Corps. The consumption rate broke the logistics pipeline. Each 16-inch shell weighed 2,700 pounds. Each powder charge consisted of 6 silk bags containing a total of 660 pounds of smokeless propellant. A single 9-gun broadside consumed over 30,000 pounds of projectiles and nearly 6,000 pounds of powder. The ammunition ship USS Mauna Kea conducted 12 underway replenishments with the New Jersey during the deployment. each transfer requiring 8 to 10 hours of precision seamanship as the two vessels steamed side by side at 12 knots while crane operators swung 2,700-pound shells across the gap on high-tension cables. One ammunition handler aboard the Mauna Kea described the transfer operation as the most dangerous thing I ever did that nobody shot at me during. The New Jersey was burning through her magazines faster than the supply pipeline from Subic Bay could refill them. Twice during the deployment, fire missions were prioritized and rationed, not because targets were scarce, but because shells were. The ground started shaking at 11:47 p.m. NVA Private Nguyen Van Thuong was in a communications trench 2 kilometers south of the Ben-Hai River when the first salvo landed. His account? Recorded in a captured unit diary recovered by Marines during Operation Bold Mariner, describes the experience in terms that have nothing to do with conventional artillery. The earth heaved. The walls of his trench, reinforced with bamboo matting and packed laterally with sandbags, buckled inward as though something enormous had pressed against them from outside. The concussion wave arrived through the ground itself, up through his boots and knees and into his spine, a full second before the sound reached him through the air. Then the sound came. He wrote that it was less a noise than a physical compression of his entire chest cavity, followed by a ringing deafness that lasted, according to his estimate, nearly 10 minutes. The impacts were over a kilometer away from his position. Night fire missions constituted roughly 40% of the New Jersey's total combat operations during the deployment. The tactical logic was straightforward. NVA logistics depended on darkness. Truck convoys, porter columns, construction crews rebuilding what daylight strikes had destroyed. All of it moved after sunset. The New Jersey's fire control radar didn't care about ambient light. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper calculated the same ballistic solution at midnight that it calculated at noon. What changed at night was the psychological dimension. The British had learned something similar during the Falklands War, when naval gunfire support from HMS Glamorgan kept Argentine positions under random harassing fire throughout the night. Sleep deprivation and the inability to predict when the next salvo would arrive wore men down. The knowledge that no foxhole or bunker offered real protection made it worse. These effects compounded over days and weeks into a degradation of combat effectiveness that no bomb damage assessment could quantify. The New Jersey's guns produced the same effect at a scale the British 5-inch guns could not approach. A single 16-inch armor-piercing shell, the Mark 8 AP round, designed originally to penetrate the belt armor of Japanese battleships, weighed 2,700 pounds and struck the earth at roughly 1,500 feet per second. The kinetic energy at impact exceeded 40 million foot-pounds. The NVA had no structure, no bunker design, no depth of earth cover that could absorb that energy. Their engineering manuals, copies of which were captured throughout the war, specified overhead cover requirements calibrated against 500-pound aircraft bombs and 155mm howitzer shells. The maximum recommended cover thickness was 2.5 meters of compacted earth reinforced with timber. A 16-inch shell penetrated that depth before its fuse even armed. The smell of cordite drifted across the gun line on still nights, hanging in the tropical humidity like fog. Crew members on the weather decks between fire missions could taste it, a sharp, acrid chemical bite at the back of the throat that lingered for hours. Inside the turrets, the ventilation blowers ran continuously to clear propellant gases after each firing cycle, but the residue coated every surface. Gunners' mates finished their watches with black smudges around their nostrils and a metallic taste on their tongues that no amount of coffee could wash away. The captured NVA unit diary containing Private Khan's account also recorded the regiment's operational readiness over the period of the New Jersey's deployment. Effective strength dropped 31%. Desertions, a category the NVA tracked with clinical precision, increased fourfold. The regimental political officer attributed the decline to the heavy naval cannon and recommended relocating all forward positions beyond 25 kilometers from the coast. The maximum range of the New Jersey's 16-inch guns was 23 miles. The political officer's recommended safe distance fell short by roughly 12 kilometers. The decommissioning pennant was 887 feet long, 1 foot for every foot of the ship's waterline length. It flew from the mainmast on December 17, 1969, streaming aft in the cold New Jersey wind at the Bayonne Naval Supply Center, a thin ribbon of fabric marking the end of a deployment that had lasted exactly 307 days from recommissioning to the announcement that the ship would return to mothballs. 307 days. The fastest turnaround from activation to deactivation of a capital warship in the history of the United States Navy. The order came from the Office of the Secretary of Defense in August 1969, while the New Jersey was still conducting post-deployment maintenance at Long Beach Naval Shipyard. Her crew learned about it from a wire service report before the official message traffic reached Captain Snyder's desk. The Navy Department hadn't bothered to inform the ship's commanding officer before briefing the press. The decision had originated somewhere above the Navy, and the Navy's own people were the last to know. The budget numbers told one story. Operating the New Jersey cost approximately $25 million per year. Crew salaries, fuel, ammunition, maintenance. The Nixon administration's defense budget for fiscal year 1970 was under pressure from every direction. Congressional Democrats wanted Vietnam drawdown reflected in spending cuts. The Air Force was protecting its B-1 bomber development funding with institutional desperation. The Army needed helicopter procurement dollars for the accelerating Vietnamization program. Something had to give, and a single battleship with no institutional champion above the rank of Rear Admiral made an easy target. The same Pentagon cost analysts who had argued against reactivation in 1967 now produced studies showing that the New Jersey's fire missions could be replicated by a combination of carrier aircraft and guided missile cruisers at lower annual cost. The studies were technically accurate in the way that a calorie count is technically accurate about a meal. The numbers added up while missing the entire point. No combination of 5-inch guns and aircraft could reproduce what 9 16-inch rifles did to a hardened target complex in 40 minutes. The Marines on the ground understood this, and so did the NVA. The cost analysts in Arlington either did not understand it or did not care. Captain Robert Peniston, who had relieved Snyder in command, assembled the crew on the fantail the morning the decommissioning order became official. 1,400 sailors standing in ranks on the same teak deck that had vibrated under their boots through 5,688 main battery rounds. The hydraulic fluid smell still seeped from the turret barbettes in the September heat, a sweet petroleum tang that mixed with the harbor salt air into something that every man aboard would remember for decades. Peniston read the order without editorial comment. The crew received it in silence. Chief Gunner's mate, Harold Breckinridge, who had supervised Turret 3 through the entire deployment, requested permission to leave the formation. He walked to the turret's base, placed his hand flat against the armored barbette, and stood there for what witnesses recalled as nearly 2 minutes. Nobody told him to return to ranks. The decommissioning ceremony itself drew almost no senior Pentagon officials, no Secretary of Defense, no Chief of Naval Operations. Rear Admiral Robert Adamson, commander of the Reserve Fleet, presided. The recommissioning had drawn the CNO personally. This time the building sent a Reserve Fleet admiral. The bureaucracy that had resisted bringing the ship back was not going to celebrate putting her away. It was going to pretend the whole episode had been a minor logistical exercise, rather than a vindication of the men who had argued for reactivation against institutional resistance. Commander Richard Alexander Smith, the same analyst whose 1966 memos had first proposed sending a battleship to the gunline, was by then assigned to a planning billet at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor. According to a colleague's later account, Smith watched the decommissioning coverage on the evening news in the officers' club, finished his drink, and said nothing. His memos had been right. The deployment had proven every claim he'd made about cost per round, survivability, and psychological effect on enemy forces. The after-action data validated his analysis down to the decimal point. The New Jersey went back into preservation cocoons at Bayonne. Cosmoline went back on the gun bores, dehumidifiers back into the magazines. The same shipyard workers who had peeled away the mothball wrapping 26 months earlier now reapplied it, working from the same Navy technical manuals, using the same preservation compounds. What happened to the men who proved the Pentagon wrong? Commander Richard Alexander Smith retired from the Navy in 1974 at the rank of captain. His fitness reports from the years following the New Jersey's decommissioning show a consistent pattern: strong marks in analytical ability, middling marks in institutional compatibility. The promotion board passed him over for flag rank twice. Smith's 1966 memos, the ones that had started the entire reactivation chain, were eventually cited in a 1978 Congressional Research Service report on naval gunfire support gaps in the fleet. The report recommended reconsidering battleship reactivation. Nobody in the Carter administration read it. Ronald Reagan's transition team did. The New Jersey came back a third time in 1982, fitted with Tomahawk cruise missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles bolted onto the same deck where Breckinridge had laid his hand against the barbette. She fired her 16-inch guns in anger again, this time into the Shuf Mountains above Beirut in December 1983, supporting Marines at the airport. The shells were from the same production lots manufactured during World War II. They worked. David Prowse, the gunner's mate who had kept hash marks on his locker door, attended the 1982 recommissioning ceremony in Long Beach as a civilian guest. He'd left the Navy in 1971, gone home to Terre Haute, Indiana, and spent 30 years working for a company that manufactured industrial hydraulic systems. He'd chosen the field deliberately. Prowse knew fluid pressure systems the way a surgeon knows anatomy, from the inside, under stress, with no margin for failure. According to his daughter's account in a 2015 oral history project conducted by the Battleship New Jersey Museum, Prowse stood on the pier during the recommissioning and wept openly. He was 34 years old and had not cried since Vietnam. The New Jersey is a museum ship now, permanently berthed on the Camden waterfront across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. Her turrets are locked in their forward-facing position. The teak decks have been restored. The Mark 37 fire control directors still track across the horizon when maintenance crews exercise them, the gears turning with the same precision they achieved in 1943. Over 250,000 visitors walk her decks annually. Most of them take photographs of the 16-inch gun barrels from below, looking up at the muzzles from the main deck, trying to capture the scale of a weapon that could throw a Volkswagen-sized projectile 23 miles. The NVA political officer's recommendation to relocate beyond 25 kilometers from the coast was implemented across the entire DMZ sector by February 1969. According to post-war Vietnamese military histories published in Hanoi, the repositioning added 11 days to the logistics cycle for frontline units in Quang Tri Province. Ammunition that had previously traveled 40 kilometers from depot to fighting position now traveled over 65. The additional distance exposed supply columns to an extra 4 hours of movement through areas covered by American air interdiction. The cascading effect on NVA combat operations in I Corps persisted for months after the New Jersey left the gun line. Harold Breckinridge, Turret 3's chief gunner's mate, the man who had touched the barbette, lives in Pensacola, Florida. He turned 82 in 2023. An interviewer once asked him whether the New Jersey's Vietnam deployment had been worth the cost of reactivation. "We spent $25 million. We made them move their whole army 15 miles inland. You do the math on what that costs the other guy."